In the heart of Ontario lies Oakville, a town draped in an idyllic serenity that almost feels like a painting. Its cobbled streets swim through rows of centuries-old brick houses, each one bearing the gentle marks of time. The soft hum of daily life fills the air, children laughing as they play, couples strolling hand in hand, the occasional car passing by with a low rumble. It is a town untouched by chaos, untouched by anything that might disrupt its peaceful rhythm. The quiet hum of Oakville seems endless, its calm waters rippling only by the smallest of breezes. It's here that the Jarvis family found their home, nearly 2 decades ago. Ethan, a brilliant architect with a penchant for solitude, sought out Oakville for its tranquility, a refuge from the world's demands. Margot, his wife, a kind-hearted social worker, sought peace in the community, where she could dedicate herself to helping others. Together, they built a life that seemed, on the surface, to embody Oakville itself, calm, predictable, perfect. And then there was Miranda, their only child. A girl who grew up surrounded by the quiet hum of this peaceful town. Her life a series of gentle chapters in the story of Oakville. From the time she was small, Miranda found solace in the pages of books. She could often be found in her favorite spot under the old oak tree in their backyard, nose buried deep in the latest mystery novel. Her parents indulged her, supporting her love of reading, letting her dream of faraway places, of grand adventures, of solving puzzles that no one else could solve. Miranda's world was full of possibilities. At school, she stood apart from the others. While the other kids played sports or chatted about the latest trends, Miranda was lost in her mind, exploring the depths of complex mysteries, unraveling questions that were far beyond her years. Her friends, Lila and Aaron, shared her passion, though in different ways. Lila, with her creative energy, would sketch the wild worlds Miranda imagined, while Aaron, the quiet one, would research the real-life unsolved mysteries that fascinated them all. Together, they formed a trio that was almost like a secret society, bound by their shared love for mystery, for discovery, for finding answers. But there was something about Oakville that didn't sit right with Miranda. It wasn't that she disliked the town, quite the opposite. It was perfect. Too perfect. The way the days seemed to blend into each other, the way the town had no secrets, no surprises. It was all too neat, too easy. And in the back of her mind, a small voice wondered, could a place this perfect really be real? Or was there something lurking just beneath the surface, something waiting to be discovered? Miranda, as she got older, began to notice things that others didn't. The way the same families lived on the same streets, generation after generation. The way some names never seemed to leave the gossip at the coffee shop. There were whispers, murmurs that didn't quite reach the light of day. Sometimes, when Miranda was out walking alone, she would see something, a shadow moving in the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement in the window of a house she'd never noticed before. But when she looked again, it was always gone. And Oakville returned to its peaceful, predictable self. But that quiet suspicion gnawed at her, an itch she couldn't scratch. One evening, as she sat in the library with Lila and Aaron, a conversation began that would change everything. "There's something wrong with the old mill," Lila said, her voice full of excitement and a hint of unease. "I saw something last night. A figure moving inside." "I swear I did." Miranda raised an eyebrow. "The old mill? That place has been abandoned for years. No one's been there in ages." "I know, but there's someone there, I saw them. Maybe there's something we've missed, something hidden. We should go check it out," Lila urged. Aaron shook his head, a look of disbelief crossing his face. "That's crazy. It's just the wind or shadows. You've been reading too many ghost stories." But Miranda felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something in Lila's voice, something that made her think there was more to this. That night, as the moon cast a dim light over the town, the three of them made their way to the old mill. The air was cold, the kind of cold that makes you aware of every breath, every footstep. The mill stood at the edge of the woods, a crumbling, forgotten structure that had once been a hub of activity. Now, it was silent. Empty. Or so it seemed. The door creaked as they pushed it open, the sound breaking the quiet like a scream. Inside, the dust was thick, settled on the floor in layers as if time itself had left its mark. The beams above creaked under the weight of years. There were no lights, no sounds, just the oppressive silence. And yet, Miranda felt a strange energy, a heaviness in the air, as though something had been waiting for them. They moved deeper inside, the floorboards groaning underfoot. It was Aaron who noticed it first, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a trapdoor hidden in the corner, almost covered by a pile of rotting crates. They approached it cautiously, the air growing colder with each step. Miranda knelt by the trapdoor, her fingers brushing the dusty wood. She noticed the faintest of footprints in the dust, leading right to it. Something in her gut told her this wasn't just some forgotten place. There was a story here, one that Oakville had buried long ago. "What is it?" Lila asked, her voice hushed as she peered over Miranda's shoulder. "I don't know, but I think we're about to find out," Miranda replied, her heart racing in her chest. Before they could do anything more, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. A figure loomed in the doorway. The air seemed to freeze. "Who's there?" Miranda called, her voice shaking more than she intended. No response. Just silence. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut. The room was plunged into darkness. And that was when Miranda realized, Oakville's perfect facade was cracking. It wasn't the peaceful town she'd always believed in. It was a town filled with secrets, hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone to uncover them. The chill wasn't just the cold. It was the chill of something much deeper, something much darker, lurking just beneath the surface. And Miranda knew, without a doubt, that the mystery she had been searching for her whole life had just found her. Mark Reynolds had never expected to end up in Oakville. It was a place that, on paper, seemed too perfect, too quiet, exactly the kind of place he had spent years avoiding. But after a series of personal and professional failures, Oakville had become the place of last resort. It wasn't as though Mark had a choice. A small-town teaching position at Oakville High was the only offer on the table after his previous life had fallen apart. Mark's childhood had been filled with both promise and chaos. Raised in the city, he had always been the golden child, the kind of student who excelled in everything. His parents were proud, pushing him toward a future that seemed bright with opportunity. He graduated from college with honors, and at first, it appeared his career was following the same upward trajectory. He had landed a prestigious job at a top university, teaching philosophy, a subject he was passionate about. But as the years passed, something started to crack. The pressure of constantly proving himself, the competition with colleagues, the demands from students, it all became too much. Mark found himself burned out, unable to focus, retreating into his own mind. His relationships faltered. His work, once full of life and energy, turned mechanical, repetitive. Eventually, his personal life fell apart, and so did his professional one. The catalyst was the incident at the university, an argument that spiraled out of control with a senior faculty member, a public confrontation that led to his dismissal. The fallout was swift. His reputation, once pristine, was tarnished. Friends turned their backs, and opportunities evaporated. No one wanted the disgraced professor. So Mark fled. He took what was left of his pride and ran, leaving the city behind. The job in Oakville had been his last-ditch effort at reinvention, a chance to start fresh away from the scrutiny that had suffocated him. Now, as Mark drove through the quiet streets of Oakville, the weight of his past pressed heavily on him. The town was picturesque, almost annoyingly so. The manicured lawns, the well-kept houses, the sleepy atmosphere. It all felt fake, like the town was a movie set. But then again, that was what he wanted. A fresh start. An escape. When Mark arrived at Oakville High on his first day, he felt the eyes of the entire school on him. It was a strange feeling, being the new teacher in such a small, tight-knit community. The staff greeted him politely, but there was an underlying coolness, a sort of distance. He was the outsider, the one who didn't belong, and everyone knew it. The other teachers made small talk, asked about his past, but Mark's responses were clipped, cautious. He had learned long ago that honesty in small towns was dangerous, so he kept things vague, offering only surface-level details. His classroom was modest, tucked away on the second floor of the building. As Mark unpacked his belongings, setting up his desk and organizing papers, he tried not to think about the future. Instead, he focused on the present, the students who would walk through the door any minute now. He knew that as a teacher, he had to build rapport, earn their respect. He had no idea how Oakville High's students would react to him, but he assumed it wouldn't be any different from any other school. High school kids were the same everywhere. The bell rang, signaling the start of class. Mark took a deep breath and stepped to the front of the room, his eyes scanning the sea of faces that filled the seats before him. They were a mix of eager, disinterested, and downright bored, typical of teenagers everywhere. But then his gaze landed on her. Miranda Jarvis was sitting at the back of the room, her eyes buried in a notebook, her attention elsewhere. She was quiet, like he had been when he was her age, always hiding behind books and trying to avoid the world. He could see something in her, a kindred spirit. Perhaps, someone who didn't quite fit in, someone who longed for something more than Oakville's small-town life could offer. But what caught Mark's attention most was the intensity with which she observed him when she looked up. It wasn't the usual disinterest he saw in the others. No, Miranda was watching him with an unspoken curiosity, as if she knew there was more to him than just a new teacher in a small town. Mark cleared his throat, beginning his lesson. But despite his attempt to focus on the material, his mind kept returning to her, her quiet demeanor, the sharpness in her eyes, the way she seemed to notice things others didn't. He couldn't shake the feeling that Miranda Jarvis was not just another student in his class. She was different. She was the one who could see through the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. As the class went on, Mark's gaze drifted back to her several times. The other students were distracted, whispering, texting under the desk, but not Miranda. She was focused, fully engaged, as if every word he said had weight, had meaning. She wasn't just learning about philosophy, she was studying him. At the end of the class, as the bell rang and students filed out, Miranda lingered by her desk, gathering her things slowly. Mark watched her for a moment before he turned to pack up his own materials. When she finally stood, she looked up at him, her gaze lingering for just a beat too long. "You'll like it here, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice soft but direct. Mark paused, taken aback. "I hope so," he replied, his words laced with uncertainty. "I'm still getting used to it." Miranda offered a small, knowing smile, her eyes lingering a moment longer before she turned and left the room. And as the door closed behind her, Mark couldn't help but wonder, what was it about her? Why did he feel like his life, already shaken by years of failure, was about to intersect with hers in a way he couldn't yet understand? Mark couldn't stop thinking about Miranda Jarvis. It wasn't just her sharp intellect, though that certainly intrigued him. It wasn't just the way she seemed to absorb everything he said, hanging on every word as if his lectures were the only thing that mattered in her world. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. As the days passed, Mark found himself paying more attention to her than any of the other students. His eyes would unconsciously drift to her during class, watching how she scribbled notes, how her eyes would flicker up when he said something that caught her interest. There was a quiet intensity to her, an energy that he couldn't ignore. The first time he really noticed it, the moment that marked the beginning of his obsession, was during a discussion about personal identity in philosophy. He had asked his students to explore the question, who are we when no one is watching? Most of the class had responded with cliches, surface-level answers about social media or family roles. But when Miranda spoke, her voice was soft, measured, but striking in its depth. "We are what we choose to be when no one is watching," she said. "But what if no one's watching, and we don't know who we are yet? What if we're just waiting for someone to show us who we can be?" Her words struck Mark hard, too hard. He found himself unable to shake the image of her. Quiet, introspective, searching for meaning in a town that offered none. There was a rawness to her words, a vulnerability that he knew all too well. He had been there once. He had spent years searching for his own identity, buried beneath expectations and responsibilities. But it was clear that Miranda wasn't just seeking answers in books or philosophies. She was seeking something else, something he couldn't name. As the days went by, Mark found himself more distracted. Grading papers, he would often pause, his mind wandering back to her. His hands would linger on her assignments longer than necessary, tracing the neat handwriting, the thoughtful insights, sometimes lingering over the subtle hints of vulnerability hidden in her words. What did she want? What did she need from him? Why couldn't he shake the feeling that their lives, their paths, were inevitably intertwining? It started as small things. He noticed the way her eyes would linger on him when he spoke, the way she would seek out his opinion during discussions. She was smart, engaged, curious, but it wasn't just that. It was the way she seemed to challenge him, as if she could see through his tired facade, as if she could read the doubts hidden beneath the surface of his carefully constructed persona. Mark had taught for years, and yet he found himself unnerved by the way Miranda seemed to effortlessly see him for what he was, beneath the professional mask. When he sat alone in his office after hours, poring over their class notes or grading papers, he would sometimes catch himself thinking about her, wondering what she was doing, how she spent her evenings, what was really behind those thoughtful eyes. What was it about Miranda that made his pulse quicken, his thoughts scatter? But it wasn't just Mark who began to notice his increasing fixation. At the local coffee shop, he overheard the whispers. "Have you heard about that new teacher, the one from the city?" Someone said. "Mark Reynolds, right? I don't know. Seems a little distant." "Yeah," another voice replied, "I've seen him around Oakville High. Keeps to himself, doesn't talk much, but I heard he's been spending a lot of time with Miranda Jarvis. Just staring at her sometimes. Weird, right?" The conversation felt like a punch to the gut. Mark knew that in a town like Oakville, gossip traveled faster than light. People noticed everything. He had already been marked as the outsider, the one who didn't belong, and now rumors about his behavior were beginning to spread. It wasn't long before Margot Jarvis, Miranda's mother, heard the whispers too. She'd known Mark only as the new philosophy teacher, a quiet man who had kept mostly to himself. But lately, she had noticed his occasional presence at the Jarvis household. Always after school hours when Miranda was studying or preparing for exams. It wasn't that she thought Mark was doing anything inappropriate, but there was a subtle change in Miranda's demeanor when she spoke about him. Her tone had become more respectful, more thoughtful, and even a little nervous. "He's just a teacher, Mom. It's fine," Miranda would say when Margot asked about Mark's influence on her. But Margot couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. One evening, while she prepared dinner in the kitchen, Margot casually mentioned to Ethan that Mark had started to make frequent appearances at the house. She was careful not to sound accusatory. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the change in Miranda's attitude made her uneasy. Ethan, ever the optimist, shrugged it off. "It's probably just a mentor thing," he suggested. "Miranda's a bright girl. Maybe he sees potential in her." But Margot wasn't so sure. There was something about the way Mark looked at Miranda, something subtle, but unmistakable. It wasn't the way a teacher looks at a student. Especially not in Oakville, where the boundaries were always clear. It felt personal. Meanwhile, Lila and Darren, who had always been close friends with Miranda, began to notice her growing attachment to Mark. At first, they thought it was harmless, Miranda's deepening interest in philosophy, her growing admiration for a teacher who finally seemed to challenge her. But as time went on, they started to see how much time she was spending with him. The late-night study sessions, the moments when she would leave the house for hours, only to return talking about Mark's lessons, his advice, his thoughts on things that seemed far beyond her age. Lila raised an eyebrow one afternoon as Miranda gushed about a conversation she'd had with Mark during lunch. "You've been talking to him again? About what? Philosophy? Or something else?" Miranda blushed, her voice a little too eager. Just stuff. You know, about life, about the way things are. He's just so different. He makes me think in a way I haven't before. Aaron's voice, as always, was quieter. Be careful, Mir. Teachers don't always have the best intentions. But Miranda didn't listen. She was too drawn in, too fascinated by Mark and his perspective on the world. She hadn't yet seen the darker side of the obsession that was blossoming in the shadows. And Mark, lost in his own thoughts, was too blinded by his desire to see it coming. Miranda had always been introspective, but recently, her thoughts seemed to swirl with a quiet unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started small, the subtle way Mark would look at her during class. The way he seemed to linger a little too long after discussions, his gaze just a bit too intense. It wasn't the way a teacher should look at a student, was it? At first, she brushed it off. He was just an eccentric teacher, after all. Maybe she was just overthinking it. But the more she tried to ignore the feeling, the stronger it grew. In conversations with Lila, Miranda tried to voice her discomfort, but she found it hard to articulate. How could she explain the unease she felt when Mark's eyes would linger on her? Or how his compliments, once flattering, now felt strangely personal? It's nothing, Lila. Really, Miranda would say, even though a part of her wasn't sure. She didn't want to make a big deal out of something she couldn't fully explain, especially since she didn't want to be the girl who overreacted. Lila, of course, had a different take. You know, Mir, Lila said one afternoon as they sat on the park bench, he's been acting kind of weird lately. You notice how he looks at you in class? I'm not sure if I like it. Miranda's face flushed. It's not like that, she replied quickly, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Lila or herself. Yeah, but if it's making you uncomfortable, maybe it's worth thinking about, Lila continued, her voice low. I mean, he's your teacher, not your, I don't know, friend. Or something more. Miranda chewed on the words, her fingers nervously tracing the edges of her book. Lila was right. Something had shifted. She could feel it, but she didn't know how to handle it. It wasn't as though Mark had done anything overtly inappropriate. Nothing she could pin down, but there was an intensity to his attention that made her skin crawl. That evening, after Lila had left, Miranda sat at her desk, her notebook open before her. The pen in her hand trembled as she wrote her thoughts down in the privacy of her journal. The one place where she could be honest without fear of judgment. November 12th. I don't know what to make of this. Every time I talk to Mr. Reynolds, I feel like he's looking at me differently. It's hard to explain. It's not like he's said anything weird or crossed any lines, but there's something about the way he watches me, like he sees more than he should. It's like he's waiting for something from me. Or maybe I'm just imagining it. But it feels wrong. I feel like I'm walking a tightrope, unsure of whether I'm falling or if I'm just waiting for something to happen. Her pen hovered over the paper for a moment, unsure of how to continue. She closed the notebook, not wanting to write any more. Even putting these thoughts to paper felt dangerous, as if by acknowledging them, she was somehow inviting them to be true. Meanwhile, Mark's life outside school was a silent spiral. Each evening, after the last of the students had left, he would sit alone in his small apartment. The walls felt too close, the silence too overwhelming. His only company was the flickering glow of the TV and the occasional bottle of wine that dulled the gnawing loneliness. He'd come to Oakville seeking redemption, a fresh start after everything had fallen apart. But here, in this quiet town, it was as though the echoes of his past followed him, haunting the empty rooms. Mark had always been a man who needed validation. That was what had driven him to excel in the first place. To prove to everyone that he was worthy of attention, of admiration. But now, in the isolation of his apartment, that need had turned into something darker. His thoughts often wandered back to Miranda, to the way she had looked at him during class. There was something in her eyes, a longing, a need for guidance, that he couldn't ignore. He told himself it was natural. She was a bright, promising student, and it was his job to mentor her, to help her navigate her world. She had potential, and he was the one who could unlock it. But as the days passed, his justifications grew weaker. He found himself fixating on her, her smile, her voice, the way she would nod slightly when he made a point in class. He could picture her, her face soft with concentration, her lips parting slightly as she listened. It wasn't just admiration anymore, it was an obsession. He couldn't help it. He was drawn to her in ways he couldn't control. And each time she entered his classroom, he felt a rush of adrenaline. A spark of something that felt both thrilling and terrifying. And yet, he told himself he was in control. He was just guiding her, helping her see the world in ways she couldn't yet understand. He would tell himself that again and again, each time the thoughts crossed a line. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't crossing any lines. At school, Mark began to spend more and more time near Miranda. He would find excuses to linger after class, offering additional guidance, discussing topics she hadn't fully grasped, when the truth was, he was simply waiting for those moments alone with her. His obsession grew, slowly but surely, and though he told himself it was harmless, deep down, he knew it was not. But the thrill of it kept him going. Soon, others began to notice. Mrs. Parker, a veteran teacher who had been at Oakville High for decades, had been watching Mark closely. She had noticed how often he seemed to be near Miranda, how their conversations lingered after the class ended. At first, she had dismissed it as nothing more than a teacher taking a special interest in a student. But as the days went by, something about it didn't sit right with her. There was a tension in the air whenever Mark was around her, a quiet energy that felt uncomfortable. One afternoon, after watching yet another one of their lengthy exchanges, Mrs. Parker decided she couldn't ignore it anymore. She casually approached Mark as he packed up his papers at the end of the day. "Mark," she said, her tone professional but laced with concern, "I've been meaning to ask you about Miranda. She's a brilliant student, isn't she?" Mark smiled, but it was a tight, forced smile. "Yes, she's exceptional. Bright, focused. A real thinker." Mrs. Parker nodded, but her eyes were sharp, probing. "You seem to spend a lot of time with her, more than the other students. Just be careful, Mark. It's important to maintain boundaries, you know?" Mark stiffened, his heart pounding for a moment before he calmed himself. "I'm just being a good teacher, Mrs. Parker. I'm mentoring her. She's got a lot of potential. I'm just trying to guide her." Mrs. Parker studied him for a moment, her gaze not unkind, but discerning. "Of course. Just be careful. Oakville's a small town. People talk." Mark forced a chuckle, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you're right. Thanks, Mrs. Parker." But as he walked away, Mark's heart raced. He knew what she was implying. He wasn't blind. He could feel the eyes of the town on him. But none of that mattered. What mattered was Miranda. She was his way out of the darkness, the light in the suffocating solitude. He just had to make her see it too. It happened one afternoon after class, the kind of moment that could have been dismissed as innocent under normal circumstances. But in Oakville, in their fragile world, it shattered everything. Mark had asked Miranda to stay after class to discuss her upcoming paper. A philosophical exploration on the nature of identity and self-perception. She was always eager, always looking for ways to improve. And though his mind was elsewhere, he focused on guiding her through the nuances of her argument. She was so much like him in many ways, intelligent, driven, lost in the pursuit of meaning. As Miranda wrote down his suggestions, her pen scratched the paper quickly, her brow furrowed in concentration. The classroom was quiet, the kind of silence that was heavy with words unsaid. Mark, standing next to her desk, pointed to a part of her paper, offering further advice. Miranda lifted her eyes to meet his. She was still, her gaze steady. For a moment, Mark felt as though they were the only two people in the world. Like the boundaries of student and teacher were beginning to dissolve. Her gaze held him in place, and without fully realizing what he was doing, his hand reached toward hers. The brush of his fingers against her skin was so subtle, so brief, that Miranda barely had time to register it. But to her, It felt like a jolt, an electric shock that made her stomach flip. It wasn't that he had touched her violently or even in a way that could be classified as overtly inappropriate. It was the way he lingered just a moment too long. How his fingers rested against hers, as though they both needed the contact for reasons neither of them could fully understand. Miranda froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and she quickly pulled her hand back, the moment slipping away in an instant. Her heart began to pound, the blood rushing to her face, a cold sweat forming at the back of her neck. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She could hear her own voice, strained and trembling, as she said, I think I understand, Mr. Reynolds. Thank you." Mark's hand was already back at his side, his gaze no longer on her but looking at the desk, avoiding her eyes. His face was unreadable, as if nothing had happened at all. Miranda quickly grabbed her things, fumbling with the papers, trying to escape the tension in the air. She was afraid, no, terrified, but she couldn't place exactly why. It wasn't as though he had done something blatant. There had been no harsh words, no invasive gestures, no threats. But in that brief moment, something had shifted. It wasn't just about the touch. It was the way Mark looked at her, the way his hand lingered just a little too long, the way his gaze followed her as she hurried out the door. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed an invisible line. A line she hadn't even known existed until now. That night, Miranda couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, her thoughts a whirlwind. What had happened? What did it mean? Her fingers still tingled from the brief touch, and the warmth of it lingered in her skin, as though Mark's hand had left some trace behind. It was all too much. She didn't know how to handle it, how to interpret it. Was it an accident? Was it a mistake? Or was it something else, something that had been building all along? Something that had been there beneath the surface and had finally erupted in that one fleeting touch? Miranda sat up in bed, the covers tangled around her legs, her heart racing. She had to talk to someone who could help her make sense of it. She grabbed her phone and called Lila. "Lila, I need to talk. Can we meet up?" Miranda's voice cracked, her fear impossible to mask. Mark sat alone in his apartment, a glass of whiskey in hand. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him. He hadn't meant to cross the line. He hadn't meant to make Miranda uncomfortable. It was just a fleeting moment, wasn't it? A brief touch, nothing more. He couldn't have helped it. She was so beautiful, so bright, so full of potential. And she had looked at him with those wide eyes that saw through everything. Saw the part of him that was lost, the part that was still searching for something. Maybe that was why he had touched her, just for a second. To feel connected to her in a way that he couldn't with anyone else. Mark's mind was in turmoil. He knew the rules. He had spent years teaching and mentoring, but this wasn't the same. He wasn't just guiding her, wasn't just offering his knowledge. He had crossed a line. But then, the rationalization began. He took another drink, and the warmth of the alcohol helped to dull the sharp edges of his thoughts. Miranda was a brilliant student. She had potential, more than anyone else. She needed someone to show her the way. She needed someone to believe in her, to push her beyond her limits. Maybe that's what he was doing. Maybe, in his own flawed way, he was helping her see the world in a new light. She had responded to him, hadn't she? She had looked at him with that same intensity, that same search for something deeper. It wasn't just about the classroom, about the lessons. It was about something else, a connection that had started to form between them, whether she realized it or not. He could justify it, couldn't he? He had tried to be a mentor. She needed guidance, and he had given it. He wasn't like the others, he wasn't like the teachers who only cared about grades or lectures. He saw something in Miranda. She had come to him, needed him, and he had simply given her the guidance she sought. She wanted more, and so did he. It wasn't wrong. Not really. The thought came again, swirling in his mind. She wanted it too. She needed it. She just didn't know it yet. He stood up, pacing the small apartment. The air felt thick with his thoughts. The self-justification wrapped around him like a blanket, keeping the coldness of his actions at bay. He didn't feel guilty. Not yet. No, he told himself. This was just the beginning. It would all work out. It was all just part of the plan. Miranda didn't sleep that night. And as the days went on, the discomfort only deepened. The moment in the classroom was no longer something she could dismiss. It wasn't just a fleeting gesture. It was a violation of something she couldn't define, something that had now become impossible to ignore. And with each passing day, the realization sank deeper, that there was something wrong, something dangerous, about the way Mark looked at her. She had to do something. But what? The days leading up to Miranda's disappearance were ordinary, at least on the surface. The chill of autumn settled over Oakville, the trees in their vibrant fall colors, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Life in Oakville had a sense of rhythm, a predictable cadence that never seemed to falter. But for Miranda, the days had begun to feel heavy, laden with something she couldn't name, something that felt wrong, like a storm on the horizon. It started with a sense of unease that she couldn't shake, no matter how hard she tried. At home, she tried to focus on her schoolwork, but her mind kept drifting. She would open her books, read the same sentence over and over, and then glance out the window, her thoughts spinning. She felt trapped, cornered by her own confusion, by the growing realization that something was happening, something she couldn't control. Her parents, though concerned, didn't know how to help. Margot noticed the subtle changes in her daughter's behavior. The way Miranda would pull away from conversations, her forced smiles, her increasingly withdrawn demeanor. But when Margot tried to ask, Miranda would brush her off, telling her everything was fine. "It's just school stuff, Mom," Miranda would say, forcing a smile as she placed a book in her bag. "I'm just a little stressed about the upcoming event, that's all." The school event Miranda was preparing for was Oakville High's annual philosophy showcase, a well-attended event that brought together students to present their ideas, their theories on life, and engage in debates. Miranda had been excited about it at first. It was an opportunity to showcase her passion, to speak out in front of an audience that would appreciate her intellect. But as the days went by, the excitement had turned to anxiety. The pressure of the event loomed over her like a shadow, and on top of that, the strange tension with Mr. Reynolds had escalated, turning what had once been a source of pride into something darker, more oppressive. Her friends, Lila and Aaron, noticed the shift too. Lila, always perceptive, asked Miranda about it during lunch one day, trying to pull her out of her shell. "You've been acting weird, Mir. What's going on? You're always so excited about the showcase, but now you just seem distant. You don't even want to talk about it." Miranda had forced a laugh. "It's just nerves, Lila. I'll be fine. It's just this thing with Mr. Reynolds, I think it's getting to me. But I'm not letting it get in the way." Lila didn't look convinced. "You need to talk to someone, Mir. This whole thing, it's not worth it. If something's bothering you, just say it." But Miranda remained silent, the words lodged in her throat. She couldn't tell Lila, couldn't explain what she didn't fully understand herself. So, instead, she nodded, her thoughts racing. "I'll be fine," she told herself. "It's just nerves." The night before the showcase, Miranda stayed up late, reviewing her notes one last time. She had worked hard, too hard to let anything stop her now. But as she sat at her desk, her hands trembling, the clock ticking away the minutes, something inside her snapped. She couldn't do it. She couldn't go through with it. She stood up, pacing the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She went to the window, staring out into the quiet streets of Oakville, her reflection staring back at her. For a moment, she thought about running, just running away from everything, from the event, from the looming pressure, from Mr. Reynolds. The idea terrified her, but at the same time, it felt like the only escape. In the end, Miranda decided she needed space, time away from everything. She called Lila late that night, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not going to the event tomorrow," Miranda said, her voice shaking. "I just can't. "I don't feel safe, Lila." "Mir, what's going on?" Lila asked, concern in her voice. "What do you mean, you don't feel safe? This isn't like you." But Miranda didn't have the words to explain. She hung up the phone quickly, not wanting to hear more. She felt suffocated. The walls of her room felt too close, the silence too loud. That night, Miranda didn't sleep. She packed a small bag, just a few clothes, her phone, and her wallet, and left the house before the sun rose, walking into the cold morning air. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away from everything. She walked aimlessly through the streets, past the places that had once felt like home. She just needed space. Just a little time to think. But as the hours passed, her sense of direction faded. She didn't know where she was anymore. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. The messages piled up, but Miranda was too lost in her thoughts to care. By noon, when Marga realized Miranda was missing, panic set in. She called Ethan, her voice trembling, and together they searched the house, checking all of Miranda's usual spots. But there was no sign of her. They called her friends, but no one had seen her. The texts and calls went unanswered. The community's reaction was immediate. The news of Miranda's disappearance spread like wildfire, and Oakville, once a town that had prided itself on its peaceful calm, was thrown into chaos. Volunteers poured into the streets, knocking on doors, searching the parks, the woods surrounding Oakville, asking anyone who might have seen her. Flyers were printed and posted, her face now a symbol of fear and confusion for everyone who knew her. The police launched a full-scale investigation, mobilizing every available officer. Detectives combed through Miranda's school records, her social media accounts, even her journals, looking for any hint as to what had led to her sudden disappearance. Mark Reynolds was questioned, his involvement with Miranda under scrutiny. He denied anything out of the ordinary, his alibi seemingly solid, but the town's suspicions grew. Whispers about his relationship with Miranda, about the rumors of inappropriate behavior, began to spread, reaching the ears of every parent, every teacher. News outlets picked up the story, sending cameras and reporters to Oakville, where every corner of the quiet town was now filled with questions. The media hounded the local police for updates, each interview with the family only deepening the mystery. The sense of dread in Oakville was palpable. In a place where nothing had ever seemed amiss, Miranda's disappearance was an anomaly, a tear in the fabric of the town's peaceful existence. The search continued day and night, but as each day passed without a lead, the fear grew. Where was Miranda? And what had happened to her? Detective Emily Reeves stood in the doorway of Oakville High, her eyes scanning the school's exterior as the cool autumn breeze brushed against her face. The peaceful town she had once heard about now felt alien, the serene streets now filled with tension and suspicion. Oakville was a town that never saw the darkness of the world's crueler realities, and yet here she was, standing at the heart of an unfolding mystery, the disappearance of a bright young girl, Miranda Jarvis, who had simply vanished into the cold night. Reeves was no stranger to missing persons cases, though this one hit differently. She had worked in the city for years, tracking criminals, solving cold cases, and bringing justice to the forgotten, the overlooked. She was methodical, driven by the smallest of details, the smallest inconsistencies in stories. Her reputation was built on finding those details and building connections where others saw only dead ends. She had an uncanny ability to read people, to know when they were hiding something, and in a case like Miranda's, where everything seemed too perfect, too clean, she knew there was something buried beneath the surface. She entered Oakville High's main office, where Principal Roberts, a stiff man with glasses perched at the end of his nose, greeted her. The school was quiet, the hum of activity replaced by the somber air of an investigation. The other teachers were scattered throughout the building, working under the watchful eye of the police, answering questions, trying to make sense of what had happened to one of their own students. Detective Reeves, Roberts said, his voice steady but strained, "I'm glad you're here. This has shaken the whole community. I know we've provided everything we can, but if you need anything, just ask. Reeves nodded curtly, her mind already shifting into investigation mode. She walked past him, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The walls, once adorned with student achievements and event posters, now felt barren, almost suffocating. She approached the teacher's lounge, where the staff was gathered, waiting to be interviewed. She started with Mrs. Parker, a veteran teacher who had taught at Oakville High for decades. Mrs. Parker, though friendly, was visibly shaken, her hands clasped tightly together as she spoke. "I've taught here longer than I care to admit," Mrs. Parker said, her voice trembling slightly. Miranda was a bright girl, always full of potential. But there was something different about her these last few weeks. She was distracted, more withdrawn. "I noticed it, but I didn't think much of it. You know how teenagers are." But she had been acting nervous, like she was carrying some weight on her shoulders. Reeves listened intently, her pen scratching against her notebook as Mrs. Parker continued. "Did you notice anything unusual about her interactions with Mark Reynolds?" Reeves asked, her voice calm but probing. Mrs. Parker hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've seen them together in the halls a lot. He always seemed to be talking to her. He wasn't the most engaged with his other students, but with Miranda, it was different. There was a kind of intensity when they spoke. Not just teacher-student, more like something more." Reeves nodded, her suspicion growing. She made a mental note of Mark Reynolds' name. He would be her next stop. Mark Reynolds' office was as cold and clinical as his demeanor. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but there was nothing inviting about the space. He sat behind his desk, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes wary but calm. Mark had the look of a man who was used to being questioned. His responses rehearsed, practiced in a way that made Reeves more curious than ever. She sat across from him, her gaze steady. "Mr. Reynolds, I need to ask you about your relationship with Miranda Jarvis. Can you describe it for me?" Mark didn't flinch at the question. His response was calm, almost detached. "Miranda was a bright student. She came to me with questions, wanting to learn more. I simply guided her, as I do with all my students. There's nothing unusual about it." Reeves studied his face, watching for any flicker of emotion, any sign that he was hiding something. His words were measured, but his eyes darted just a little too quickly when he mentioned Miranda. She leaned forward slightly. "You said you guided her. Was there ever anything inappropriate in your interactions?" she asked, her voice careful but direct. Mark's eyes locked onto hers for a moment, and Reeves caught the briefest hint of defensiveness in his posture. He cleared his throat. "No. I would never do anything inappropriate. I'm simply a teacher. I'm here to educate." But there was something in his words that didn't sit right. His insistence, the way he kept referring to his role as a teacher, felt almost too rehearsed. Like he was trying to convince not only her but himself as well. Reeves stood, her eyes narrowing slightly as she gathered her notes. "I'll need to speak with some of your colleagues about your behavior towards Miranda. I'd also like to see any journals or records you've kept on her progress." Mark's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Of course. I'm happy to cooperate." As the interviews continued, small pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It was during the second day of questioning that crucial evidence emerged. Detective Reeves, alongside her team, had been combing through Miranda's belongings, hoping to find some clue as to where she had gone. It was in her bedroom that they found something unexpected. A charm bracelet, old and tarnished, with a single, engraved charm shaped like an owl. The bracelet was unusual, but what stood out to Reeves was the engraving. It wasn't the kind of jewelry a teenage girl would wear, at least, not the kind Miranda would choose. It was delicate, almost vintage, a gift from someone who knew her intimately. And then it hit her, she'd seen something similar. It was a moment of clarity. During one of the interviews with the teachers, Mrs. Parker had mentioned something strange. She had seen Mark wear a bracelet, a thin, almost identical one, on the day of Miranda's disappearance. It wasn't a large detail, but it stood out now, in the wake of the bracelet's discovery. The two pieces were unmistakably linked. Reeves moved quickly, piecing everything together. She returned to the school the next day and began to search through Mark's office. There, buried among stacks of student papers, she found his journal. Flipping through the pages, Reeves was struck by the obsessiveness of his writing. Notes on Miranda's progress, yes, but also personal observations. Details about her appearance, her personality, even her movements. The journal was full of entries that read like a confession, each page more disturbing than the last. She's beautiful. So much potential. She doesn't know how much I can help her. She will come to understand what I see in her. And in the last entry, the words that stood out the most. I know what I need to do. She's mine. Reeves' stomach turned. She knew then that she had to move fast. The evidence was undeniable. Mark Reynolds had crossed a line. He had become obsessed, and Miranda was now missing because of it. The days following Miranda's disappearance were a blur of frantic searches, false leads, and mounting dread. Oakville, a town that had once prided itself on its tranquility, was now suffocating under the weight of uncertainty. The search operation had expanded beyond the town's borders, with hundreds of volunteers combing through the dense woods surrounding Oakville, calling out Miranda's name into the silence of the trees, hoping for a sign, a clue, anything to lead them to her. The police had mobilized immediately, working around the clock, but even they were beginning to feel the strain. Detective Reeves, though determined, couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of frustration that was slowly eating away at the team. Every day brought more uncertainty. The leads were scarce, the sightings unreliable, and every trail they followed led to dead ends. It felt as though Oakville had swallowed Miranda whole. The search teams, divided into units, had scoured every inch of the nearby forests, the lake shores, the empty streets. Canine units were brought in, their trained dogs working tirelessly, their noses to the ground as they searched for any trace of Miranda. But every time a lead turned out to be a false alarm, the air grew heavier. Volunteers grew exhausted, and the emotional toll on the families, particularly Miranda's parents, was almost unbearable. Margot Jarvis was a woman whose strength had been the foundation of her family. But now she looked hollow, drained by worry, the weight of her daughter's disappearance nearly suffocating her. Ethan, her husband, had become a man lost in his own grief, his face gaunt and pale as he paced the house, unable to sit still, unable to rest. I can't sit here, Margot. I need to be out there, looking for her. We have to keep looking, Ethan would say, his voice filled with desperation, his hands trembling as he pushed through the crowds of volunteers. He couldn't stand the thought of not doing something, of being helpless in the face of his daughter's vanishing. Margot would nod, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. I know, Ethan. But we're doing everything we can. We have to believe she's out there. We have to. But even as the search continued, there was no sign of Miranda. No calls, no texts, not a single clue to her whereabouts. And yet, somewhere deep inside, Margot knew that her daughter was still alive. She could feel it, despite the overwhelming fear gnawing at her heart. Miranda, however, was not lost. She had simply vanished from the world as she knew it, choosing to hide herself in a place no one had thought to look. A small, abandoned cabin deep in the woods, far beyond the reach of the search teams. It had started with a single instinct, a need to get away from everything. Away from Mark, away from the pressure of the showcase, away from the suffocating fear that had taken root in her chest. The night she had left, Miranda had wandered through the streets of Oakville, unsure of where she was going. She had felt a primal need to escape, to find somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, even if she wasn't sure where that was. The cabin had appeared like a gift, almost as if the world itself had delivered it to her. The first night was spent in cold fear, the darkness thick and overwhelming. Miranda had curled up on the floor, using her jacket as a makeshift blanket, trying to block out the sounds of the wind howling through the trees. Her stomach was empty, her mind racing with thoughts of everything that had led her to this moment. She thought about her parents, her friends, about Oakville, and about Mark. She couldn't make sense of what had happened, why she had felt so trapped, why she had run, but she knew she couldn't go back. Not yet. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and fear. She had no food, no water, no plan. But Miranda was resourceful. She remembered the survival lessons she'd read in books, in stories about lost hikers and adventurers. She knew that she had to keep moving, keep thinking, keep surviving. She ventured out into the woods during the day, searching for any source of food she could find. She found berries, wild apples, and streams of fresh water, each discovery a small victory in the face of fear. She rationed her supplies carefully, eating only when she had to, saving enough to get by. As the days passed, she found herself growing more resilient, more determined. The panic that had consumed her in the beginning began to fade, replaced by a survival instinct she didn't know she had. But as she scavenged for food and water, a part of her mind would drift to the past, back to happier times, to the world she had known before everything became a blur of fear and confusion. She thought of Lila, how she had laughed with her just days before, sitting under the oak tree in the park, sharing books and secrets. She remembered the warmth of her mother's hugs, the smell of her father's cologne. And above all, she thought of the simple moments, the ones she had taken for granted, the sound of her mother calling her in for dinner, the way her friends had teased her about being the bookworm, the way she had always felt safe, grounded in the world around her. Those memories kept her going. They reminded her that she wasn't lost forever, that the world she had known still existed somewhere out there. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't a ghost. One night, as she sat alone by the fire, trying to keep warm, Miranda felt the overwhelming pull of fear. She thought about Mark, about how he had looked at her, how his presence had begun to suffocate her. She thought about the touch of his hand, the way it had made her skin crawl. She had run from him. She had run from what he represented. But even in the darkness, Miranda knew she wasn't just running from him. She was running toward something, toward survival, toward hope. And as the days turned into weeks, she clung to that hope, to the belief that someday, someone would find her, that someday, she could go back to the life she had left behind. The search was relentless, but the forest was vast, and Miranda was clever. Every day the police worked tirelessly, the community rallied together, and yet, no sign of her appeared. Each day felt like a weight on the searchers' shoulders, each moment slipping away like sand through their fingers. But deep down, both the search teams and Miranda knew, no matter how long it took, there was always the possibility of finding a way home. The air in Oakville was thick with tension, and the once quiet streets now buzzed with the overwhelming presence of police, media, and a community in crisis. Detective Emily Reeves stood in front of the Oakville Police Department, staring out over the town that had changed forever. She knew what had to come next, even if no one else did. Mark Reynolds was the key, and it was time to break him open. The arrest was swift. Mark had been found in his small apartment, the journals, the charm bracelet, the evidence of his obsession all pointing back to him. As the officers knocked on his door and stepped inside, he didn't resist. He barely even blinked, as though he knew the moment had come. His gaze was cold, distant, as if he had already surrendered to the inevitable. "Mark Reynolds," one of the officers said, his voice flat. "You are under arrest for the abduction of Miranda Jarvis. You have the right to remain silent." Mark didn't flinch, his body stiffening only slightly. He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. There was no struggle, no fight. He simply let them cuff his wrists, the metal biting into his skin as though he were already resigned to what was coming. The ride to the station was long and quiet. Mark sat in the back of the patrol car, staring out the window, his expression unreadable. He knew what the evidence said. He knew he couldn't deny what had happened. But there was still a part of him that believed he could control the narrative, that he could make them understand. At the Oakville Police Department, Detective Reeves prepared for the interrogation. She knew Mark was dangerous, but she also knew that, like all criminals, his ego would be his downfall. She was methodical, always patient, always careful to peel back the layers without pushing too hard. But with Mark, it was different. She knew she had to get inside his head, show him that she could see through his carefully constructed facade. She watched as Mark was led into the interrogation room, his face pale but composed. He sat down at the metal table, his eyes scanning the room, as though looking for an escape, though he knew there was none. "Mr. Reynolds," Detective Reeves began, her voice calm but firm. "You've been arrested on suspicion of the abduction of Miranda Jarvis. Do you understand the charges?" Mark's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "I understand," he said slowly, his voice smooth, betraying none of the fear or guilt that must have been gnawing at him inside. "But I didn't abduct anyone." Reeves leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Then why did you run? Why did you lie to the police? Why did you keep hiding the truth?" Mark's expression faltered for just a moment, and for the briefest second, Reeves saw the crack in his carefully constructed armor. He quickly recovered, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't run. I just didn't think I needed to answer to anyone. I didn't do anything wrong." Reeves nodded, keeping her voice steady. "So, you didn't have anything to do with her disappearance? You didn't force her to go with you? You didn't make her feel trapped?" Mark's jaw tightened, and he sat up straighter in his chair. "I didn't force her. She came to me. She needed me." There was an unsettling calm in his voice, a conviction that made Reeves' skin crawl. She could see it now, the obsession, the delusion. Mark wasn't just hiding the truth. He believed it. "You're delusional," she said softly, her voice cutting through the room. "Miranda never needed you. She was a student. She was just trying to get through her life. You manipulated her, twisted her mind, and you couldn't accept that." Mark shook his head, his eyes wide with intensity. "No, you don't understand. She was special. She was the one. She was the one who needed me, and I was going to show her how much we could be together. We were meant to be together. She just didn't see it yet." Reeves leaned in closer, her face inches from his. "What did you do to her, Mark?" Mark's gaze didn't waver. There was no remorse, no regret. His obsession had grown so deep, so all-consuming, that he truly believed everything he had done was justified. He didn't see it as a crime. He saw it as destiny. "I didn't hurt her," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to protect her. She didn't understand. She wasn't ready. But I knew. I knew we had to be together. I've spent so much time with her. She is so perfect. I showed her everything, everything. And she's going to see that. She'll understand what I'm doing for her." Reeves sat back, her stomach churning. She had heard confessions before, but there was something chilling about Mark's words. His tone was calm, matter-of-fact, like he was explaining a simple truth. He believed what he was saying. He was convinced of it. "You think she's going to forgive you for this?" Reeves asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You think she's going to see this as an act of love?" Mark's face twisted, his expression almost serene. "She will. She has to. We belong together. She was always meant to be mine. We were meant to be perfect." Reeves could feel her hands shaking as she reached for the folder in front of her. She opened it slowly, pulling out the journals, the evidence that would finally bring him down. She placed them on the table in front of him, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. "These," she said, her voice cold, "are your words, Mark. The way you wrote about her. The way you stalked her. The way you planned every move. You were obsessed with her. And now we have the proof." Mark glanced at the journals, his eyes briefly darting to the pages, then quickly back to Reeves. He didn't seem afraid. He didn't even look guilty. In fact, his lips curved into a small, almost sad smile. "I don't need to explain anything," he said. "I did what was right. Miranda will understand. I'll make her see. She'll forgive me. She'll come back to me." The finality in his voice was chilling. He wasn't just confessing to a crime, he was justifying it. In his mind, he was a savior, a protector, he wasn't the one in the wrong. He truly believed that Miranda was meant to be with him. Reeves sat back, her mind racing as she absorbed the full weight of what he had said. This wasn't just a crime of passion or desperation. This was something much deeper. Mark Reynolds was a man lost in his own delusion, and Miranda had been nothing more than the object of his fixation. "You're going to prison, Mark," she said, her voice cold. "And no matter how much you want it, you will never see her again. You'll never have the chance to twist her life to fit your delusional vision. You've ruined everything." Mark's smile didn't fade. "She'll come back," he whispered, almost to himself. "She has to." Reeves stood up, turning toward the door. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded in Oakville. The life of a young girl who had been preyed upon by someone she should have been able to trust. Someone who had twisted the very meaning of love into something monstrous. As she stepped out of the interrogation room, the door clicking shut behind her, she knew one thing for certain: this case, this story, wasn't over. The aftermath would ripple through Oakville, and the scars would remain. But for now, Mark Reynolds was where he belonged. Behind bars. The air in Oakville was filled with an overwhelming sense of relief the day Miranda was found. The community, which had been frozen in fear for weeks, erupted in a collective exhale as the police, guided by a series of new tips and discoveries, made their way through the woods to the abandoned cabin where Miranda had hidden herself. The rescue was quiet, almost anticlimactic. There were no dramatic confrontations, no chase scenes. Instead, it was a moment of delicate triumph. A young girl, cold, scared, and exhausted, but alive. Miranda had been lying on the floor of the cabin, wrapped in what little warmth she had been able to create. She had heard the searchers calling her name, but in the dark isolation, it had felt like a distant dream. When the officers finally found her, their first words were simple but filled with an overwhelming sense of hope: "You're safe now. We're taking you home." The moment Miranda was reunited with her parents, it was as though the world had stopped spinning. Margot rushed to her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she held her close, murmuring words of relief and disbelief. Ethan, standing a few feet away, looked as though he hadn't believed this day would ever come. He wrapped his arms around both of them, a family reunited after what felt like an eternity of uncertainty. "I knew you were out there, Mir," Margot whispered, her voice breaking. "I knew you were alive." Miranda clung to her mother, feeling the warmth of her embrace. The love that had always been there but had seemed so distant during her days of hiding. She had been so terrified, so sure that she might never see them again. But now, in their arms, it felt like everything had returned to normal, like the nightmare had finally ended. The entire town celebrated in a way they hadn't in years. People flooded the streets, gathering in the town square to give thanks. There were prayers, hugs, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the safe return of one of their own. Oakville, which had been divided by suspicion and fear, was now united by joy. The search had ended, and though the scars would remain, there was a sense of peace, for now. But the aftermath of Miranda's disappearance was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Mark Reynolds was arrested, charged, and eventually brought to trial. The proceedings were lengthy, each day revealing more about the depth of his obsession and manipulation. As the evidence was presented, his journals, the recordings, and his interactions with Miranda, the town was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationships between teachers and students, the blurred lines of mentorship, and the power dynamics that existed within the walls of Oakville High. The trial was an emotional roller coaster for Miranda and her family. Though Miranda had been rescued, the process of confronting what had happened to her was no easy task. She was forced to relive moments she wished she could forget, her courage and strength becoming a beacon not only for her family but for the entire community. Each time Mark took the stand, his delusions became clearer to everyone watching. But it was the final confrontation, the moment Miranda gave her testimony, that resonated the most. In her statement, she said, "I don't know why he did what he did, but I know that what happened was not love. It wasn't care. It was control. I am not his. I am my own person, and I get to decide who I am and what my life looks like. Not him." Her words were met with a standing ovation in the courtroom, and though it didn't erase the pain, it gave her back her voice. It gave her back her life. As Mark was sentenced to prison, Oakville began to reflect on the policies that had allowed him to prey on his students. School boards across the country began to take a harder look at teacher-student relationships, enforcing stricter codes of conduct and increasing awareness around boundary issues in education. Oakville High implemented mandatory training for all staff members, ensuring that everyone understood the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries. Policies were updated, and new measures were put in place to protect students from any similar occurrences in the future. The town, though forever scarred, began to heal. It wasn't the same Oakville that had been before the events of Miranda's disappearance. The innocence was gone, replaced by a community that was now more aware, more cautious, but also more compassionate. Oakville had come together in a way that no tragedy had ever forced them to before. For Miranda, the journey to healing was long and challenging. Though her family and friends surrounded her with love and support, she knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But she was determined to move forward, not just for herself, but for others who had suffered in silence. A year after her return, Miranda began writing her memoir. It wasn't just a way to tell her story, it was a way to reclaim her life, to turn her pain into something meaningful. She wrote not as a victim but as a survivor. She wanted others to know that they weren't alone, that there was always hope, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart. In the opening pages of her book, she wrote, "I was once a girl who thought I had no power over my own life. I was lost in fear, in confusion, in a world that didn't seem like it would ever make sense again. But I learned that fear is not the end. It's the beginning of something new. I will not let what happened to me define me. I will define myself." Her words were powerful, and soon, her book became a beacon for others, a guide for anyone struggling to find their voice in the aftermath of trauma. Miranda used her experience to empower those around her, creating a support system for young girls who had experienced similar pain. She spoke at schools, met with counselors, and worked with organizations dedicated to helping survivors of abuse. As for the other key characters, their lives had been irrevocably changed. Margot and Ethan, once consumed by fear and helplessness, had found strength in their daughter's resilience. They became active in supporting causes for child protection, their grief now channeled into advocacy. The couple, once distant from the community, became its pillars, working to ensure that Oakville's children would be better protected in the future. Lila, Miranda's best friend, had always been there for her. But after everything, their bond grew even deeper. She stood beside Miranda at every step of the way, offering her love and strength as Miranda reclaimed her life. Lila became a voice of empowerment in her own right, speaking out against the dangers of manipulation and encouraging others to trust their instincts and speak out. Miranda's story was not just one of survival, it was one of transformation. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and used it to change the world, to ensure that others would not have to endure what she had. And in the end, Oakville would never forget. The town had been shaken, but it had also been awakened, ready to embrace a future where safety, awareness, and compassion stood at the forefront.